The phone rang while I was finishing up a client presentation at work. My mother's voice cut through the line like ice. She said my brother Travis took out a $785,000 loan, and it was my duty to pay it back. I froze, confused. I never borrowed any money. She insisted I come to dinner that evening to discuss it. Before I could explain, she hung up. I stared at my phone, heart pounding, dread settling in my stomach. I sat in my car outside my parents' house in suburban Colorado for 10 minutes before I could force myself to walk to the door. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn that my father Richard maintained with obsessive care. Everything about this house looked normal, peaceful even, but I knew what waited inside. My mother Patricia opened the door before I could knock. Her face was cold, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't hug me. She didn't even say hello. She just turned and walked back into the house, leaving me to follow. The dining room table was set with our usual dishes, but the atmosphere was anything but usual. My father sat at the head of the table, his jaw clenched, staring at his plate. My brother Travis, 32 years old and still carrying himself with that entitled swagger I'd grown up resenting, sat across from where my mother pointed for me to sit. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Nobody spoke as my mother brought out the food. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. A normal Sunday dinner. Except everything about this felt wrong. Finally, my father cleared his throat. His voice was heavy with disappointment. A tone I'd heard directed at me many times growing up, usually when I didn't live up to whatever standard he'd set that I didn't know about. He told me that Travis had taken out a business loan 3 years ago, $785,000 to start a tech consulting company. I was listed as the co-signer. The business failed 6 months ago, and now the bank was demanding payment. Travis had no money. As the co-signer, I was legally responsible for the entire debt. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I set down my fork carefully, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I told them I never co-signed anything. I never even knew Travis was starting a business. I made $60,000 a year as a graphic designer. Why would anyone approve me as a co-signer for that amount of money? My mother's eyes flashed with anger. She said Travis had shown them the paperwork. She called me a liar. My father shook his head slowly, like I was a child caught in an obvious lie. I demanded to see this supposed paperwork. Travis finally moved, reaching down to a folder beside his chair. He slid a stack of documents across the table to me. His face was carefully neutral, but I caught something in his eyes. Satisfaction. Smugness. I picked up the papers with trembling hands. There it was. A loan application from 3 years ago. My signature on the co-signer line. My social security number. My address from back then. The apartment on Maple Street. Everything looked official, legitimate, real. But I never signed this. Then, it hit me. 3 years ago, Travis had stayed with me for 2 months. He'd told me he was between jobs, that he just needed a place to crash while he figured things out. I'd let him sleep on my couch. I'd let him have access to my apartment, to my space, to my files. I looked up at Travis. The realization must have shown on my face because his expression flickered, just for a second. I accused him directly. I told him he forged my signature. He stole my identity. He used my personal information to get this loan while he was living in my apartment. Travis's face shifted into an expression of hurt disbelief. He asked how I could say something like that. He was my brother. My mother gasped like I'd slapped her. My father's face turned red. They said Travis would never do something like that. My mother started crying, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. She said I was being paranoid and ungrateful. My father reminded me that family helps family. He said Travis had worked so hard on his business that it wasn't his fault the market changed and the company failed. He said the bank was threatening to take Travis's house, the one he'd bought with some of the loan money, as his business headquarters. I felt like I was going crazy. I told them I wasn't going to pay for a debt I didn't create. I was going to report this as fraud. I was going to go to the police. The room went silent. My mother's tears stopped instantly. My father stared at me like I'd announced I was planning to murder someone. My mother's voice went cold. She said if I did that, I would destroy this family. My father said I'd be sending my own brother to prison over money, that I was choosing money over family. Travis sat back in his chair, saying nothing, but that slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. He knew. He knew our parents would take his side. He'd counted on it. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I told them I couldn't believe they were doing this. I was the victim here, and they were treating me like the criminal. My mother said I was being dramatic. My father said I was being selfish. I grabbed my purse and walked out. Behind me, I heard my mother calling me ungrateful. I heard my father saying I'd regret this. I heard nothing from Travis. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, shaking with rage and hurt. My own family, my own parents, they'd chosen to believe Travis over me without question. They'd decided I was the problem. I drove home through blurred vision, tears streaming down my face. When I got to my apartment, I locked the door and slid down to the floor, my back against it. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. It said we weren't done talking about this, that I needed to do the right thing. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark, wondering how my life had turned into this nightmare. I barely slept that night. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. I needed to know the full extent of the damage. At 8 in the morning, I called my bank. I requested a full credit report. The customer service representative told me it would take a few minutes to pull up. Those few minutes felt like hours. When she came back on the line, her voice had changed. More careful, more sympathetic. My credit score had plummeted from 760 to 580. There were 6 months of missed payments on a loan I'd supposedly co-signed. Late fees, penalties, interest charges. The original $785,000 had ballooned to over $820,000, but it got worse. Travis had opened 3 credit cards in my name, all maxed out. $68,000 in additional debt. He'd made minimum payments for about a year, then stopped. Collections agencies had been trying to reach me, but they'd been sending notices to my old address. The one Travis had when he stayed with me. The one he must have used to reroute my mail. I thanked the representative and hung up. Then, I ran to the bathroom and threw up. After I'd cleaned myself up, I searched online for lawyers specializing in identity theft. I found Daniel Foster, who had good reviews and offered a free consultation. I called his office, and somehow got an appointment for that afternoon. Daniel Foster was in his mid-40s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened to my entire story without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. He told me I needed to file a police report for identity theft and fraud immediately. Then I needed to dispute the debts with the credit bureaus. The process could take months or even years. And here was the problem. The bank might sue me before the investigation concluded. If I couldn't prove the signature was forged, I'd be liable for everything. I asked him how much his services would cost. He quoted me an initial retainer of $20,000. I felt sick again. I had maybe $3,000 in savings. I was living paycheck to paycheck. There was no way I could afford this. Daniel saw my face and offered to take the case on a payment plan, but I'd still need at least $5,000 up front. I told him I'd figure it out. I left his office feeling more hopeless than when I'd arrived. I went straight to the police station. The officer who took my report, Sergeant Hayes, was a middle-aged man with tired eyes. He was sympathetic, but realistic. He explained that proving identity theft within families was extremely difficult. The signature on the loan documents looked real enough that even an expert might not be able to definitively prove it was forged. It would become a he-said-she-said situation. Travis would claim I consented to co-sign and now regretted it. Still, I filed the report. At least it was official now. At least there was a record. I drove home exhausted, emotionally drained. When I got to my apartment, there was a certified letter waiting for me. My hands shook as I opened it. The bank was suing both Travis and me for the full amount, $823,000. They wanted immediate payment, or they'd seize assets. The court date was in 30 days. I called Daniel Foster from my car, my voice barely steady. He said he'd been expecting this. He told me to send him the lawsuit paperwork immediately. We needed to respond fast. That evening, my phone rang. My mother. I almost didn't answer, but I did. She was screaming. How could I file a police report against Travis? How could I call my own brother a criminal? My father got on the line. His voice was cold, controlled. He said I was tearing this family apart. That Travis was the victim here, not me. That I was being vindictive because I'd always been jealous of Travis. I tried to explain about the credit cards, the stolen identity, the full extent of what Travis had done. My mother called me a liar. She said Travis would never do those things. She said I probably opened those cards myself and forgot that I was trying to blame Travis for my own financial problems. I hung up on them. 5 minutes later, my older sister Diane called from Seattle. She'd heard from our parents. She begged me to drop the charges. She said I was making things worse. She said even if Travis did do something wrong, family should handle it privately. She said I was being selfish, thinking only about myself. I told Diane I loved her, but I couldn't talk right now. I hung up. I sat alone in my apartment, looking at the lawsuit papers spread across my coffee table. I was being sued for over $800,000 for a debt I didn't create. My family had completely turned against me, and I had no idea how I was going to afford to defend myself. I called Daniel again. I told him I couldn't afford the retainer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he believed me. He'd heard enough stories like mine to recognize the truth. He offered to reduce his upfront fee to $3,000, and we'd figure out payments later. He said he couldn't let someone lose everything because they couldn't afford justice. I cried on the phone with him. I told him I'd get him the $3,000 somehow. I'd take out a loan, max out my one remaining good credit card, borrow from friends, whatever it took. After we hung up, I applied for a personal loan online. With my destroyed credit, I was only approved for $15,000 at a horrific interest rate. But I took it. I had no choice. I transferred $3,000 to Daniel's office that night. The rest would have to cover living expenses while I figured out how to survive this. I barely slept again. I kept thinking about Travis sitting at that dinner table, smug and silent, knowing our parents would protect him, knowing he'd destroyed my financial life and gotten away with it. But I wasn't going to let him win. I couldn't. The next 2 weeks blurred together. I worked my regular design job during the day, then picked up every freelance project I could find at night. I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. I'd lost 10 pounds because I forgot to eat. My friends started asking if I was okay. I told them I was fine, just busy with work. I couldn't tell them the truth. I was too ashamed, too afraid they'd look at me differently. Daniel filed motions to delay the lawsuit while the identity theft investigation proceeded. The judge granted a 60-day extension, but that was all. The clock was still ticking. Daniel suggested we hire a forensic handwriting expert to analyze the loan documents. It would cost $3,000. I scraped together the money from my freelance work and sent it to him. The expert, Dr. Helen Brennan, took a week to examine the signatures. When her report came back, I felt the last bit of hope drain from my body. She concluded that the signatures appeared authentic. The pressure, angle, and flow matched my normal signature patterns. She suggested that if it was a forgery, Travis had practiced extensively or traced my signature carefully. Without the original documents to test the ink and paper, she couldn't prove forgery conclusively. Daniel delivered the news gently, but we both knew what it meant. Without definitive proof, I'd likely lose the lawsuit. A judge would see a co-signed loan with my signature and my information and rule that I was responsible. I could be paying this debt for the rest of my life. I sat in Daniel's office, staring at the report, feeling defeated. Then Daniel said something that sparked an idea. He mentioned that family fraud cases often involved patterns of behavior. If we could prove Travis had a history of financial manipulation, it would strengthen our case. I thought about Travis's ex-girlfriend, Morgan. They'd dated during the time he got the loan. She'd broken up with him suddenly, and he'd been furious about it. I wondered if she knew anything. I found Morgan through social media and sent her a message. To my surprise, she responded within an hour. She said she'd be happy to talk. We met at a coffee shop the next day. Morgan was a petite woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a guarded expression. When I explained who I was and what Travis had done, her expression changed from cautious to angry. She told me Travis had always been scheming, always looking for easy money. She remembered him talking about getting a big loan to start a business, but the business was barely real. He had no actual plan. He spent money wildly on a new car, expensive dinners, trips to Las Vegas. She'd questioned him about it, and he'd gotten defensive. Then Morgan told me something crucial. She said Travis once bragged about how easy it was to get money when you knew the system. He'd made a joke about how signatures didn't matter if you had the right information. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time, but now it made horrible sense. Morgan also remembered that Travis had a friend named Kyle Burton, who worked at the bank where Travis got his loan. She thought Kyle was a loan officer. Travis used to talk about Kyle helping him with financial stuff. I thanked Morgan profusely. This was the lead I needed. I went home and searched for Kyle Burton online. I found him on social media and discovered something interesting in his employment history. He'd worked at Mountain West Bank as a loan officer 3 years ago. But 18 months ago, his employment there ended abruptly. No new job was listed. I did more digging. I found a local news article from 18 months ago. Kyle Burton had been fired from Mountain West Bank for irregularities in loan processing. The article was vague on details, but it was enough. I called Daniel immediately. He was excited by this information. If Kyle had been involved in fraudulent loan processing, and he'd helped Travis get the loan using my forged signature, it proved a conspiracy. It suggested Travis had inside help to circumvent the bank's verification procedures. Daniel filed a motion to subpoena Kyle Burton's employment records and any communications between Kyle and Travis from 3 years ago. The judge granted the subpoena. For the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe I had a chance. Then, everything fell apart again. 2 days after we filed the subpoena, I received a notice from the court. Travis had filed a restraining order against me. He claimed I'd been harassing him, showing up at his house, making threatening phone calls. It was all completely fabricated. I'd never gone to his house. I'd never called him. But the temporary restraining order was granted pending a hearing. I was now legally prohibited from contacting Travis or coming within 300 feet of him. Worse, Travis had gone to the local newspaper. The story ran on page 3 of the Metro section. The headline read, "Man's Business Dream Crushed. Sister Refuses to Honor Loan Agreement." The article portrayed Travis as a hard-working entrepreneur whose business failed through no fault of his own. It painted me as a vindictive sister who'd agreed to co-sign his loan, then changed my mind when the business struggled. Travis was quoted saying he was devastated by my betrayal, that he'd trusted me as family and I'd turned on him. My name was in the article, my full name. Within hours, people I knew had seen it. A coworker sent me a screenshot, asking if I was okay. My boss called me into his office. He said he wasn't judging, but he was concerned about the controversy. He asked if it would affect my work. I assured him it wouldn't. 3 of my freelance clients emailed me that afternoon, apologizing but saying they needed to pause our projects. They were sorry, but they couldn't work with someone in the middle of a major financial dispute. They were worried about my stability. I watched my income disappear. I watched my reputation crumble, and Travis was behind all of it, painting himself as the victim while destroying me piece by piece. That night, I received a letter. It was from my parents. A formal letter, not even a phone call. They stated that I was no longer welcome in their home. They couldn't support someone who was trying to destroy their son. As far as they were concerned, I was no longer part of the family, unless I dropped the charges and helped Travis pay off the loan. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. I didn't cry. I'd run out of tears. My sister Diane stopped answering my calls. I tried texting her. Nothing. She'd chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. I sat in my apartment, reading the news article about myself online. The comments section was full of strangers calling me selfish, greedy, a terrible sister. People who didn't know me, didn't know the truth, had decided I was the villain. Travis had turned everyone against me, and he was winning. I couldn't give up. Not now, not after everything. When the subpoena results came back from the bank, Daniel and I spent days going through hundreds of pages of documents: Kyle Burton's employment file, his email records, his loan processing history. Finally, we found something. Email exchanges between Kyle and Travis from 3 years ago. The language was coded, but the implications were clear. Travis had asked Kyle about processing paperwork for a loan. Kyle responded with instructions about what documentation he'd need. Travis mentioned he could get the signatures. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was evidence of conspiracy. Daniel filed an amended response to the lawsuit, including the emails and information about Kyle's termination for irregularities in loan processing. We argued that Travis and Kyle had conspired to defraud both me and the bank. The bank's attorneys reviewed our new evidence. A week later, they contacted Daniel with an offer. If I dropped the criminal charges against Travis and Kyle, the bank would remove me from the lawsuit and pursue only Travis. They'd also work with the credit bureaus to clean up my credit report. It was tempting. So tempting. I'd be free of the debt. My credit would be restored. The nightmare would end. But Travis would barely face consequences. He'd be sued by the bank, but without criminal fraud charges, he could just declare bankruptcy and walk away. He'd never truly pay for what he did. Daniel advised me to take the deal. He said fighting further would cost tens of thousands more in legal fees with no guarantee of winning. The settlement was the smart, practical choice. I told him I needed time to think. That night, I received an email from an unknown address. No message, just attachments, photos, and documents. The photos showed Travis and Kyle meeting at various locations over several dates 3 years ago: coffee shops, restaurants, a park. The documents were bank statements from Travis's personal accounts showing large cash deposits around the time the loan money was dispersed. I stared at my computer screen, heart pounding. This was evidence of money laundering, possibly embezzlement. But who sent it? And how did they get it? I forwarded everything to Daniel immediately. He called me within an hour. The bank statements showed something shocking. The loan was for $785,000, but Travis had somehow siphoned off an additional $140,000 through fake vendor payments for his supposed business. He'd made nearly $1 million total from this fraud scheme. But Daniel had concerns. The evidence came from an anonymous source. We didn't know who sent it or how it was obtained. If it was acquired illegally, it might not be admissible in court. We needed to verify its authenticity. Daniel hired another forensic accountant to examine the documents. While we waited for results, I tried to figure out who could have sent the information. A former business associate of Travis? Someone from the bank? Kyle's enemy? I didn't have to wonder long. That night, my phone rang from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice spoke. Deep, threatening. He told me to back off, to accept the bank's settlement and drop everything. He said if I kept digging, things would get worse for me. Then he described my daily routine. When I left for work, where I bought coffee, what grocery store I used. He knew where I lived, down to my apartment number. I felt ice run through my veins. He hung up before I could respond. I immediately called the police. Sergeant Hayes took my report seriously, but without a recording or caller ID, there wasn't much he could do. He advised me to be careful. He also mentioned that the criminal investigation into Travis was moving slowly. Travis had hired a lawyer and wasn't cooperating. Without more concrete evidence, the case was weak. I installed extra locks on my apartment door that night. I bought a security camera for my entrance. I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Someone was threatening me. Probably Travis or someone working for him. They were trying to scare me into silence. It was working. My money was almost gone. I'd spent over $20,000 on legal fees, investigators, and experts. My credit cards were maxed. I was behind on rent. My landlord had left me a warning notice on my door. If I didn't pay by the end of the month, I'd be evicted. I was working 70-hour weeks, but I couldn't keep up. The stress was destroying my health. I'd lost 15 pounds. I was having panic attacks. I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept through the night. I looked at the anonymous evidence on my laptop screen. I looked at the settlement offer from the bank. I thought about the threatening phone call. I had to decide. Take the settlement and walk away with some semblance of a life. Or keep fighting for justice and risk losing everything, including possibly my safety. I called Daniel. I told him I couldn't take the settlement. Not after everything Travis had done. I was going to fight with the anonymous evidence, even if it was risky. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he respected my decision. He'd do everything he could to help me win. The forensic accountant verified the documents over the next week. They were authentic. The account numbers matched Travis's known accounts. The signatures on the fake vendor invoices matched Travis's signature patterns. This evidence was real. Daniel filed emergency motions with the court, presenting the evidence of embezzlement and expanded fraud. The judge agreed to review everything and delayed the trial by 30 days. Travis's lawyer responded aggressively. They filed a motion, claiming the evidence was obtained illegally and should be excluded. They demanded an investigation into how I obtained private financial records. They suggested I'd committed a crime by receiving stolen documents. The judge ordered a hearing to determine if the evidence was admissible. At the hearing, I thought we were making progress. Daniel presented the evidence professionally. He argued that the source didn't matter because the documents themselves were genuine and showed criminal activity. Then Travis's lawyer called a surprise witness, Kyle Burton. Kyle took the stand and told a complete lie. He claimed that I'd contacted him months ago, that I'd offered him money to fabricate evidence against Travis. He said I'd sent him the documents and asked him to pretend they were real. He said he'd refused, and now he was coming forward to expose my scheme. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process what I was hearing. Kyle produced fake emails supposedly from an address similar to mine, offering him payment to lie about Travis. I took the stand and denied everything under oath. Daniel presented phone records showing I'd only called Kyle once, briefly, weeks ago. But Kyle's fake email chain looked damaging. The judge said she needed time to review everything, but I could see doubt in her eyes. Kyle had sounded credible. Travis and Kyle had coordinated a perfect counterattack. Then the judge said something that made my blood run cold. She was ordering the district attorney to investigate whether I'd tampered with evidence or conspired to fabricate documents. I was now facing potential criminal charges myself. For trying to expose Travis's fraud, I might go to prison. I left the courthouse in a daze. Daniel tried to reassure me, but his voice sounded hollow. That evening, my best friend Jessica called. She'd been my rock through all of this, but her voice was strained. She said she believed me, but she couldn't be involved anymore. Her employer had seen the news coverage. They were concerned about her association with someone under criminal investigation. Her job was at risk. She was so sorry. She cried as she said goodbye. I was completely alone now. No family, no friends, no support. Just me against Travis, Kyle, and a system that seemed determined to punish me for being a victim. I sat on my apartment floor, back against the wall, security camera monitoring my door. I'd lost everything, and I might lose my freedom too. For the first time, I truly considered giving up. What was the point? Travis had won. He'd destroyed me completely. Maybe I should just accept whatever happened and stop fighting. But then I remembered something. During Kyle's testimony, he'd mentioned specific details about the anonymous documents: transaction amounts, dates, account numbers, details that were never made public in court filings. The only way Kyle could know those specifics was if he'd actually been involved in the fraud with Travis. He'd slipped up. I called Daniel. It was 11 at night, but he answered. I explained what I'd noticed. He pulled up the hearing transcript. I was right. Kyle had revealed knowledge he shouldn't have had. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny crack in their story. Daniel said we'd file a motion pointing out Kyle's slip. It might not be enough, but we had to try. I hung up and sat in the dark. I was exhausted, broken, alone, but I wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. The district attorney assigned to investigate me was Sarah Morrison, a sharp woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense attitude. She interviewed me in a small gray room at the courthouse. I told her everything. The fraud, the anonymous documents, Kyle's lies on the stand. Sarah listened without expression. She said the investigation would take time. She couldn't make any promises. I left feeling like she didn't believe me. Daniel filed a motion requesting a deposition of Kyle, where we could question him extensively about his testimony. The judge granted it. It was our last chance to prove Kyle was lying. The deposition took place in a conference room at Daniel's law office. Kyle arrived with his lawyer, looking confident and relaxed. Over the next 3 hours, Daniel questioned him relentlessly about his relationship with Travis, his time at the bank, and his testimony about me offering him money. Kyle stuck to his story. But Daniel kept circling back to the anonymous documents, asking Kyle to describe them in detail. Kyle became defensive. His answers got shorter, more evasive. Then, exhausted after hours of questioning, Kyle made his mistake. Daniel asked him to describe the bank statements again. Kyle, frustrated and wanting to prove he knew what he was talking about, provided specific details. Account numbers, transaction amounts down to the cent, exact dates. Daniel paused. Then he asked the crucial question: how did Kyle know these details if I had fabricated the documents? Kyle froze. The color drained from his face. He'd just proven he had insider knowledge of transactions that only someone involved in Travis's scheme could possess. Kyle stammered, trying to backtrack. His lawyer tried to intervene, but the damage was done. It was on the record. Daniel filed a motion with the court the next day. The deposition transcript was attached. He argued that Kyle's testimony proved he was involved in the original fraud and was lying to protect himself and Travis. He requested the judge dismiss the evidence tampering allegations against me and reopen the investigation into Travis and Kyle. I waited 3 days for the judge's response. 3 days of barely eating, barely sleeping, constantly checking my phone for updates from Daniel. Then I received another email from an anonymous sender. This time, it contained audio files, hours of them. I clicked on the first file with shaking hands. It was a phone conversation between Travis and Kyle from 3 years ago. They were discussing how to forge my signature. Travis was asking Kyle how to make sure the loan application wasn't flagged for verification. Kyle was explaining the process, telling Travis what information he'd need from me: my social security number, my employment information, copies of my signature from multiple documents to practice tracing it. The conversation was explicit, detailed, damning. I listened to file after file, some from 3 years ago, discussing the fraud, others from recent weeks. In one recording from 2 weeks earlier, Travis and Kyle were laughing. They were discussing how to frame me for evidence tampering. Travis joked about me being too stupid to see it coming. Kyle said the fake emails he'd created were perfect. I could barely process what I was hearing. This was everything. Complete proof of the conspiracy, the fraud, the recent plot against me. The email included a brief message this time. I'm Margaret Burton, Kyle's ex-wife. He destroyed my life with his lies and schemes. When I heard what he did to you, I had to help. I've been recording his calls for months for my divorce case. He doesn't know. Use these to bury them both. I immediately sent everything to Daniel. He called me within minutes, his voice more excited than I'd ever heard it. He'd have the recordings verified, but if they were authentic, this was the smoking gun we needed. Over the next 2 days, Daniel hired a digital forensics expert who confirmed the recordings were genuine, unedited audio files. The voices matched Travis and Kyle. The recordings had been made from Kyle's phone, likely through cloud storage that Margaret had access to as his wife during their marriage. Because she'd obtained them legally during divorce proceedings, they were admissible. Daniel worked around the clock preparing emergency motions. He filed them on Thursday morning, submitting the audio recordings as evidence. He argued that the recordings proved the original fraud, the conspiracy, the embezzlement, and the recent plot to frame me. He requested immediate arrest warrants for both Travis and Kyle, for fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, embezzlement, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. I allowed myself a tiny bit of hope. Maybe, finally, this was over. That night, I came home from grocery shopping to find my apartment door ajar. My heart stopped. I'd locked it. I was certain I'd locked it. I called the police from the hallway. When officers arrived and cleared the apartment, I walked in to find devastation. My place had been ransacked. My computer was smashed. My backup drives were gone. All my physical documents related to the case were shredded and scattered across the floor. The security camera had been destroyed too, but not before capturing footage of a masked man breaking in. The footage was saved to cloud storage. Police couldn't identify him from the video, but the break-in was clearly targeted. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had specifically destroyed my evidence. Fortunately, Daniel had copies of everything at his office. The recordings Margaret had sent, all the documents, everything was safely stored. But the message was clear. Travis and Kyle knew I had damning evidence, and they were desperate. The break-in was reported to the police. It was added to the growing list of crimes Travis and Kyle had committed. Daniel filed the emergency motion the next morning. He included the break-in as further evidence that Travis and Kyle were dangerous and actively trying to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. He argued they were flight risks. The judge reviewed everything that afternoon. I sat in Daniel's office, unable to focus on anything, waiting for news. At 4 p.m, Daniel's phone rang. He answered, listened, and then smiled for the first time in months. The judge had granted the motion. Arrest warrants were issued for both Travis and Kyle. By 6 that evening, both were arrested. Travis was taken from his house in handcuffs. The local news was there, having gotten a tip about the arrest. This time, the headline was different. Brothers arrested in elaborate identity theft and fraud scheme. I watched the news footage on my phone from a cheap hotel room. My apartment was a crime scene and I couldn't stay there anyway. I'd also been evicted for non-payment of rent. I was homeless, essentially. Everything I owned was in 2 suitcases and a backpack. But watching Travis being led away in handcuffs, his face pale and shocked, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Travis and Kyle would fight the charges. They'd hire lawyers. This could drag on for months more. And I was still broke. Still alone. Still dealing with the aftermath of everything they'd done. But for the first time since that phone call from my mother, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had a chance at justice. The district attorney, Sarah Morrison, called me 2 days after the arrests. She apologized. She said after reviewing the audio recordings and all the evidence, it was clear I'd been telling the truth from the beginning. The investigation into me for evidence tampering was closed. I was in the clear. I cried when I hung up. Relief flooded through me so intensely I couldn't stand. Over the next week, things moved quickly. Travis and Kyle were formally charged with federal crimes: identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion for the unreported embezzled income, witness tampering. The charges kept piling up. Daniel explained that the audio recordings made the case airtight. Prosecutors had Travis and Kyle on tape, discussing the entire scheme in their own words. Defense would be nearly impossible. Travis's lawyer contacted Daniel with a message. Travis wanted to talk about a plea deal. Kyle's lawyer sent a similar message. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of 20-plus years in federal prison if convicted at trial, both men were ready to negotiate. The plea negotiations took 3 weeks. Daniel kept me informed every step of the way. Kyle agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 years in federal prison. He also agreed to testify against Travis and provide a complete account of the fraud scheme. He'd cooperate fully with investigators. Travis held out longer, but eventually his lawyer convinced him he had no choice. The evidence was insurmountable. Travis pleaded guilty and received 12 years in federal prison. Both were ordered to pay full restitution to the bank and to me, though Daniel warned me that collecting money from people in prison was unlikely. When Daniel called to tell me about the final plea deals, I sat down on the hotel bed and just breathed. It was really over. Travis was going to prison. Kyle was going to prison. They'd both admitted guilt. I'd been vindicated. But I felt empty. I'd won, but I'd lost so much in the process. The bank settled with me the following week. Their lawyers acknowledged that Kyle's involvement as their employee meant they'd failed in their duty to prevent the fraud. They agreed to remove all negative marks from my credit report. They'd reimburse me for $23,000 in legal fees. And they'd pay me $75,000 in damages for harm to my reputation and emotional distress. It wasn't enough to compensate for what I'd been through, but it was something. Within days, my credit score was restored to 760. The fraudulent credit cards were erased from my record. Financially, on paper at least, I was free. Daniel helped me file a civil lawsuit against Travis for additional damages. With his criminal conviction, the civil case was straightforward. I won a judgment of $350,000 for legal defense costs, lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages. Travis had no money to pay it, but the judgment was on record. If he ever earned income after prison, I could garnish it. More importantly, it was official legal acknowledgement of what he'd done to me. I reached out to Margaret Burton to thank her. We met at the same coffee shop where I'd met with Morgan. Margaret was a quiet woman in her late 30s with sad eyes. She told me about her marriage to Kyle, about the lies and manipulation she'd endured for years. She said helping me was also helping herself heal. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. We'd both survived men who'd tried to destroy us. That created a bond. 2 weeks after Travis's sentencing, my mother called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Patricia was crying. She apologized. Sort of. She said they didn't know. They couldn't have known. Travis had lied to them too. She said she and my father wanted me to come home. They wanted to be a family again. I listened calmly. Then I spoke. I told her that they did know. They knew I was telling the truth, but they chose not to believe me. They chose Travis over me without question. They called me a liar. They disowned me. They abandoned me when I needed them most. I told her that forgiveness wasn't something I could give right now. Maybe someday, but not today, not tomorrow. I needed time. I needed them to understand the damage they'd caused. My mother was shocked. She'd expected me to immediately welcome them back. She got defensive. She said they were just trying to keep the family together, that I was holding a grudge. I told her this wasn't a grudge. This was self-protection. I ended the call. My sister Diane called separately the next day. Her apology was different. She took real accountability. She admitted she'd been afraid to stand up to our parents. She'd taken the easy path. She asked if we could slowly rebuild our relationship. I told her I was willing to try. We started talking once a week on the phone. It was awkward at first, but it was a start. Diane was the only family member who truly acknowledged her failure. With the settlement money from the bank, I found a new apartment. Small, but mine. I furnished it simply. I was starting over from almost nothing, but that was okay. My former employer reached out. They'd seen the news about Travis's conviction. They apologized for doubting me. They offered me my job back with a raise. I accepted. One of my former freelance clients, impressed by my resilience and fight throughout the ordeal, offered me a full-time senior position at her marketing firm. The salary was $85,000. Better benefits, more stability. I gave my notice to my old employer and took the new job. For the first time in over a year, I had financial security. I had a safe home. I had hope for the future. But I still struggled. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Lisa Chen. No, wait. I can't use Chen. Dr. Lisa Patterson. She helped me work through the trauma, the anxiety, the panic attacks, the trust issues. Slowly, week by week, I started to heal. 6 months after Travis's sentencing, I was sitting in my apartment on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and looking out the window. Sun was streaming in. The city looked alive and beautiful. I realized I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. Peace. My life wasn't perfect. I still had moments of anger, of sadness, of wondering why my family had failed me so completely. I still had nightmares sometimes about being buried in debt, about being threatened, about being alone. But I'd survived. More than survived. I'd fought back and won. I decided to write about my experience. I spent 2 weeks crafting an article about what happened, about family betrayal, about identity theft, about fighting for justice when everyone around you says to give up. I titled it, "When Your Family Becomes Your Enemy, One Woman's Fight Against Identity Theft and Betrayal." I submitted it to a national online publication that focused on personal essays and social issues. They accepted it immediately. The article published on a Tuesday. Within hours, it was being shared widely on social media. By that evening, it had thousands of comments. By the end of the week, it had over 1 million views. People reached out from everywhere. Dozens, then hundreds of messages. People thanking me for telling my story. People sharing their own experiences of family betrayal, financial abuse, identity theft. People saying my story gave them courage to fight back in their own situations. I read every message. I responded to as many as I could. I realized my nightmare had become something meaningful. My pain had turned into something that helped others. A woman in Ohio wrote that she'd been struggling with identity theft by her ex-husband for 2 years. She'd been ready to give up. Reading my story made her decide to keep fighting. She thanked me for showing her it was possible to win. A man in Florida said his brother had defrauded him out of his inheritance, and their parents had sided with the brother. He'd felt so alone. My article made him realize he wasn't crazy, that he deserved justice too. Message after message, story after story. I'd thought I was alone in this experience. I wasn't. Family financial abuse was more common than I'd ever imagined, and victims often stayed silent because of shame, because of family pressure, because they thought no one would believe them. I started a blog to continue sharing resources about identity theft, family fraud, and rebuilding after financial abuse. It grew slowly but steadily. One evening, I got a call from Diane. She'd read my article. She cried as she told me how proud she was of me. She said she'd shown it to our parents. Our mother had cried too, but for different reasons. She was starting to understand the full scope of what I'd been through. My father called a week later. His voice was gruff, uncomfortable. He didn't apologize directly, but he said he'd been wrong. He said he should have listened to me. It wasn't much, but from him, it was significant. I told him I appreciated that. I told him I still needed time. He said he understood. The road to repairing those relationships would be long and uncertain. I wasn't sure if full reconciliation was even possible or desirable, but at least there was acknowledgement now. At least there was a beginning of truth. I focused on building a new life. I made new friends through support groups for financial fraud victims. I started dating again, cautiously. I took up hiking and found peace in nature. I saved money and paid off my debts. My credit was excellent again. I was building a foundation that was truly mine. On the 1-year anniversary of that first phone call from my mother, I sat down and wrote in my journal. I reflected on everything that had happened: the betrayal, the fight, the loss, the victory. I wrote, "They tried to make me pay for a debt I didn't owe. In the end, they're the ones who paid. Not just in legal consequences, but in losing me. I was always worth more than they knew, and now I know it too. That's the real victory." I thought about the naive version of myself who'd answered that phone call a year ago, the woman who still believed family loyalty went both ways. That woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, wiser, but also more compassionate. I'd learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. I'd learned that some people will never choose you, and that's when you have to choose yourself. I'd learned that justice is possible, but it requires courage. It requires fighting even when you're exhausted, even when everyone tells you to stop, even when the cost seems unbearable. I looked out my apartment window at the sunrise. The light was golden, beautiful. I'd been broken and rebuilt. I had scars, but I also had strength I never knew I possessed. I'd survived a betrayal that should have destroyed me. Instead, I'd destroyed the lie. I'd reclaimed my life, my truth, and my power. The smile on my face was genuine. Not the forced smile from that awful dinner a year ago, but a real smile. The smile of someone who fought and won. The smile of someone who knows she can face anything now, because I did it alone. And that means I know I can survive anything. I want to leave you with this. True strength isn't avoiding pain. It's enduring pain and choosing to fight back anyway. Family loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your well-being or your truth. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries, even with family. And justice, while slow and imperfect, is possible when you refuse to give up. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, if you've ever felt alone in fighting for the truth, I want you to know, you're not alone. Your truth matters. Your fight matters. Don't give up. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for justice against overwhelming odds? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and standing up for yourself? What would you have done in my situation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one, and your stories matter. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories about resilience, survival, and fighting back against injustice. And share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in their struggle. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. I hope my experience gives you courage for your own battles. Remember, you're stronger than you know, and you deserve justice. Stay strong, keep fighting, and never let anyone make you pay for a debt you don't owe, whether that debt is financial or emotional. Until next time.